Hi everyone, how are you today? In this video, I'm going to be talking about a book that I read about a year ago called Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad is best known as the author of Heart of Darkness, which was a novel critiquing British imperialism in Africa. He wrote a number of novels in addition to that novella, including Lord Jim, which is a great novel, but also Nostromo. And this had been on my list a long time. I kept putting it off because I tried to read it several times and just found the beginning very difficult to get into, which I will talk about in a moment. But once I finally read it last year, I thought it was well worth reading and quite possibly one of the best novels of the 19th century. Quick note about Joseph Conrad. He lived and wrote late 1800s, early 1900s, and his lifespan covered the end of the wooden ships and the beginning of steam. And he lived through some interesting times, such as the sinking of the Titanic and first flight, which he wrote about in his memoirs. As for his writing, his first language was Polish, his second language was French, but he wrote in his third language, English. And I have to say, regardless of how you feel about Joseph Conrad as an author, his writing is some of the most incredible, just for his depth of understanding of human nature and just the sweeping narration that he brings. So what's Nostromo about? As you can see from the cover, it's kind of a dark novel. It doesn't really start out that way, so there's 3 parts, and I'm just going to talk about each of them. This will be spoiler free, but I'm going to talk about what happens on a very high level without getting into any major spoilers. Part 1 is called The Silver of the Mine, and in part 1 he introduces us to this fictional country called Costaguana in 19th century South America. I actually took a college history course in Latin American history, and it was very interesting because it followed it took place during the same time period, and it focused very much on the iterations of both the imperialism and also these military leaders that would rise up. And these military dictatorships would start out with good intentions, but some of them did not always turn out good. Obviously, it depends on which particular situation you're talking about or country, but there was this pattern of juntas, these military dictatorships taking over. And so this book kind of covers that in this fictional setting. First part, like I said, is very much about world building and introducing us to the main characters. The main character here is a man named Nostromo, but he does not feature very heavily in the first part. The first part actually features an Englishman named Charles Gould, who grew up in Costaguana and inherited this silver mine from his father. And the mine is run down. It was... basically, the government officials had coerced his father into buying it during this time of revolution, and it was all done manipulatively, so it became this cursed family inheritance, which Charles, the son, has decided to reinvent as a working silver mine. So he's on good terms with the current president of Costaguana, whose name is President Ribiera. Through this sort of government-private corporation arrangement, Charles ends up being able to provide good jobs to the area, and of course he works with the government to try to keep things stable. He's married to this beautiful woman named Amelia, who's very supportive, and has these neighbors who also are supportive of him. So that's kind of the premise that we're starting out with in part 1, and Nostromo himself is kind of a minor character. As I mentioned earlier, it took me quite a while to get through the beginning of the book. This is not Conrad's best writing in terms of drawing you in, and it could be because this is third person, and my favorite writings by him tend to be first person. But if you can make it through, the first several chapters, it starts to pick up a little bit as it goes into these character sketches of the Englishmen and the politicians and so forth. Okay, so that's part 1, just this world building and character introduction. Part 2 is called The Isabels, and it does introduce some new characters. So there is a young woman named Antonia, who is the daughter of a statesman, a pro-democracy statesman. And there is a young man named Martin Decoud, who is a journalist who is head over heels in love with Antonia. And there's a couple other characters that are introduced. Basically, though, this part talks about the political situation heating up. Basically, the president, Ribiera, he's very idealistic, but he's not able to get a good grasp on ruling the country. And he's being threatened by this group of rebels called the Monterists. And they follow this General Montero, who wants to take over the country and stage a military coup. So while this is happening, as you can imagine, the silver mine being so connected with the democratic government is in danger from being taken over by these Monterists. And of course, the Europeans, Charles Gould and his wife, their lives are at risk, frankly, because Montero does not like them. And so Nostromo kind of gets mixed up in all this. But one thing I really liked about Nostromo, the character, is that Conrad takes care not to make him too political. He's got his own agenda, his own vices and virtues, and he's just supposed to represent more of a common man or an everyman. So he gets involved, but rather reluctantly, with all that's happening. The plot does kind of pick up here. What I will say is, though, there weren't a lot of appearances by Charles Gould, and I felt like it was a little difficult to follow and slow because of that. There's also an interesting device here that Conrad uses in telling the story. He tells a great deal of the plot developments through this long letter that the journalist Martin is writing. Stylistically, it's good, but it does slow the book down, so I didn't really care for that. Finally, part 3. Again, going to tell you some high-level plot points, but no major spoilers. So, the political situation is about to boil over. General Montero is just sweeping across the country, and he has invaded this city, Sulaco, and come to establish a reign of terror. So all the citizens flee the city, and Charles Gould, however, he is determined to hold the fort and protect his silver mine. And his wife, meanwhile, is just... she's become secondary to his ambitions and his love for this silver mine. So that's kind of one thing that's happening. I can't really give too much else away simply because it is such an intricate plot and there are some pretty big things that happen in part 3. But yes, it really picks up in this part. This was my favorite part of the book. It feels like a Western kind of course set in South America. It actually was so intense I had a pretty bad nightmare at one point from this book, but it's that just speaks to how well Conrad writes when he's in, in the groove, so to speak. So let me just talk about the book holistically here, without going any more into the plot. What I loved about this book was the commentary on imperialism and the double-edged sword of British American investment in South America. Like, he shows you some of the pros of that, but also the cons. If you've read Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South or watched the TV series, you'll remember John Thornton, the main character. He's very business-focused and very, at times seemingly cold, but he also brings stable jobs to people and improves conditions where he is. Same kind of deal with Charles Gold here, but we also see his self-centered side and his selfish ambitions that sacrifice his wife's happiness. The other cool thing about Nostromo is the perspectives on the Democratic President Rivera and the totalitarian dictator Montero, and how neither of them are very effective in governing their country, and both sides are too strongly influenced by foreign powers. And if we're talking about diversity in writing, what I will say for this book is every character has a weakness and a strength, and it doesn't matter whether they're white or Latino or rich or poor. They're just very well-rounded and developed characters. I really loved the female characters in this book too. Emilia Gold, the wife of Charles, she's very devoted to him. You might think she's weak, but really she tries to do the best she can in the situation she's in. Exerts her own influence to try to make things better for people. Antonia, who is, if you'll remember, sort of this more modern, liberated, quote, liberated woman, she really is interested in politics, actually. I don't believe she actually gets into politics officially, but it's her passion to see Costaguana become democratic. There's also a character named Linda who starts out as the daughter of an innkeeper and later becomes the keeper of a lighthouse, which I thought was really cool, and I've never seen that before in this kind of book. So all in all, great characterization, great female characters. And I could go even further into the characters, but that's just a highlight. Again, I think the writing is actually this book's weakest point because I loved the concept. It does pick up very much in the last third of the book. But yes, the pacing is slow. Another device that he uses in part of the book is a flashback through the form of a guided tour. So there's a gentleman who is showing some people through the city later on, and he's recalling what happened, which I thought was kind of neat. But again, when you've got such an exciting book, if you use those kind of devices too much, it just slows it down. So I thought that was too bad. I would say this is definitely not quite as readable as Lord Jim or any of his shorter fiction. Nonetheless, I loved the concept so much and how it portrayed this era and this history in this fictitious setting. So I gave it 4 stars, and I'm sure I will read it again. There is also a 1997 TV series. I think it's on YouTube. The script was not so great because they really tried to not leave things out, but at the same time they weren't so good at helping you understand what was going on. So you can check that out. Unfortunately, the quality was not so good, the visual quality, but it's a decent adaptation. You get like the gist of the story if you don't want to read this whole novel, but I would definitely recommend trying this if you have the patience to stick with it. So that's Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.